All right, welcome everybody to the latter part of the lecture of political orientation and political socialization. And today we're going to look at the role of the news media in covering politics. And I will have to admit, in my many years of teaching, this lecture has evolved over time, given the advent of fake news and um, disinformation. And so, really, I will talk about, of course, if the news media reporting remains reliable. But I think part of our exploration of the news media means that we have to share that responsibility too as consumers of the news media. And so you'll hear me talking about media literacy in this lecture a lot more. And it's important for us to know, given the fact that in a democracy, we should be able to, distinguish fact from fiction, what is hyperbole from what is truth. And so with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So as you can see, we're going to tackle the chapter on the news media today. And if I were in class, I would have opened it up for a brief discussion and asked all of you where you get your news. And some of you may have mentioned social media. Some of you may have mentioned the internet, where I would have then pressed upon you to narrow down your answers by giving me a particular news outlet that you consume. And so certain students have mentioned, some obvious answers would be major newspapers like the New York Times, Fox News, CNN. But understand that there are a wide variety of news media outlets today that is accessible to us via the internet, via our tablets. I challenge all of you to read up on international news, particularly newspapers abroad who clearly have a different perspective of what's going on in the United States and our politics here. I would encourage you to read, for example, or watch BBC News, right? The British Broadcasting Company, or perhaps read the Guardian newspaper based out of Great Britain, or Le Monde from France, or Der Spiegel from Germany. You have other news media news outlets from the Middle East as well, and so uh, expose yourself to a wide variety of news outlets. I think that's important, and you'll see why that lesson is important in understanding news media and bias later on. And there are other news magazines out there. You probably have heard of Time Magazine, Newsweek, Foreign Affairs. I like to personally like to read Foreign Affairs or the Atlantic. There are certain websites that are pretty good. Vox does some pretty good reporting. Even PBS has their news program, the PBS NewsHour, or their investigative news show, Frontline. I mention all of these because I think the important lesson here is to understand that all media has some form of bias. They try to be objective, but understand that in today's um, modern world, in the world that we live in, of 24/7 news, understand that there are times clearly that their bias is revealed. And so my point in this lecture is for you to identify where those biases are, what causes those biases, so you could become a much more well-informed, well-educated citizen. So that said, let's take a look at the media trends, and this is where I plug in the holes there for you of identifying media bias. Clearly, network news have reduced in viewership. If you look at media 40, 50 years ago, there was no cable news, so the major news networks were only ABC, CBS, NBC. Then, of course, PBS came along. But in recent times, network news has, in fact, reduced in viewership. A lot of people have shifted, of course, to cable news as well. CNN and Fox being, of course, the most popular. When you look at the rise of, I'm sorry, the lack of, in fact, the popularity of talk radio was, in fact, an important source of news media, particularly for the older demographic, for older adults. This has, in fact, I would say, reduced less and have reduced less in popularity in recent times, just because there are so many different alternatives to radio. One of which, of course, are podcasts, and I'm sure a good number of you may, in fact, get your news or listen to a number of podcasts that you download or you upload via your tablets or your phone. Speaking of millennials, and most of you are now Generation Z, Y and Z, a lot of millennials have said that they have gotten their news mostly from infotainment, like Comedy Central. Clearly social media, your Twitter feeds or your Facebook feeds, has news stories that perhaps your friends share, and I'm sure I can actually guarantee that. And so, in order to understand sort of the bias here, you have to understand who owns these media news outlets, and this has been a trend now for quite some time, where you're seeing much more of a consolidation and corporate ownership of these media conglomerates, right? You take a look at ABC being owned by the Disney company, NBC, who's owned by Comcast. They used to be owned by General Electric, and General Electric at the time provided like 90% of nuclear energy to the US military. So I think it's pretty obvious that when NBC ran a story about the US military, that they would do so favorably, given that GE was the owner. Again, it's that type of connections that I want you to realize, that you have to understand that what's reported has some economic biases tied into it. Let's see here. You have CBS being owned by Viacom, Fox being owned by Rupert Murdoch. All right, and you see a lot more of this media consolidation. You're seeing more narrowcasting, right, where news media outlets cater to their own audiences, and you know this. In fact, I would say, if you look at Fox News, their target audience are going to be mainly conservatives, libertarians, Republicans. MSNBC, that's, you could argue, is the opposite of Fox, caters to much more of a progressive liberal audience. And if you look at all of the other news media outlets, which we'll take a look at in a different slide here, you'll see that they do target their specific audience. And this is a problem because you could argue that this has exacerbated the hyperpolarization and hyperpartisanship and how we talk politics. If we don't see the other side, if we only listen to people that we agree with, right, we get stuck in this echo chamber where we are unable to see the alternative positions on issues, and being able to evaluate the other side's arguments. And this is very dangerous, again, if we don't see the other side here, because most of the time, particularly um, those more extreme news media outlets tend to demonize the other side, and so you could see that this has caused some, I would say, some negative consequences in how we've talked and continue to talk politics here. Other factors include, of course, the rise of digital media, the diversity in the internet. Here's the problem when it comes to authority. Anyone can publish anything that they would like in the internet, and so you really don't know if these people are experts or if they're just giving their opinion. You really don't know if they know what they're talking about, right? All of these things make it difficult for us to assess the viability or the reliability of the information that we consume. And so again, we have to be smart about it. Okay, and as I've already discussed, this has led to today's hyperpartisan rhetoric, really on both sides, at all spectrums here. This lack of civility, which it's my goal in this class, is for us to stop that, right? For us to have much more civil conversations, so we can actually address the issues, the challenging problems that we face. And so this is something that has uh, gone viral online, and I thought it was actually pretty good. It's a chart here that allows you to identify media biases, and as well as identify some authoritative news media websites and firms versus the questionable ones. It was created by this patent attorney, Vanessa Atoro, and I don't think she's um, too much of an expert here, although I will have to give her credit that what she created here, I think, is beneficial for us to look at. Now, understand she's also biased as well, but I like the way that she used this table to analyze the bias of these news media outlets. So if you look at the horizontal axis, there's this difference between liberal versus conservative news media outlets. And if you look at the vertical axis, from the top, you have original fact reporting that is very, very reliable. And as you go down on that vertical axis, the quality of the reporting decreases tremendously. That by the time you get down there to the lower levels, you really have this again fabricated inaccurate info, real fake news with some intentionality here of not being reliable at all. And so where you really want to be looking at, folks, are the ones that are in the higher part of this table, this graph, and in the center. And as you can see, there's a good number of them, of course, that you can rely. The Associated Press and Reuters are mainly fact-based. You have NPR, BBC that leans a little bit more left. Time and The Economist a little bit more right. You can see where the news media outlets are. CNN, as you can see, skews a little bit more liberal. And then, folks, you have, I would say, the ones that you should be very, very wary, very cautious about consuming, and that's the ones below, right? On the liberal side, watch out for Occupy Democrats, watch out for US Uncut. On the right side, definitely watch out for InfoWars, folks, The Blaze. These are very, very questionable media outlets. You should be questioning the reporting as much as you can. And so hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea of what to rely on and what not to rely on. Now let's turn to media literacy here, you guys. Again, it is important that you know what you're watching, you know what you're consuming, and you got to know the difference really between real reporting versus entertainment. There is this idea of news being entertainment, and so you got to be smart enough to know what's satire and what's news reporting. And so again here, this goes to Vanessa Otero's graph in the previous slide when it comes to quality news reporting. And I would say news is news, right? This is what you should be relying on. These are fact-based. They have high journalistic standards. Journalists have to back up what they're reporting, making sure that what they're reporting, of course, is accurate. I would classify the New York Times and the Associated Press would fall under this category. And in today's news, folks, unfortunately, there's a lot of talking heads, and you're not just getting facts, but you're getting opinion, right? You get political pundits who are giving their opinion, what their take on the news is, and you have to be careful what they say. And op-ed columnists like David Brooks or Thomas Friedman from the New York Times, you have to know in a way who these people are. It may behoove you to research who these political pundits are, so you know where they're coming from. Infotainment, as I've already mentioned to you, media is sometimes considered entertainment. They satirize the news to poke fun of it, all right? And so a good number of these websites that I've listed here are pretty funny, and they are funny, but you have to understand that their purpose is to entertain and not necessarily to inform, right? The Onion, Comedy Central, The Tonight Show are all examples of this. Propaganda, okay? Propaganda is one-sided political ideological arguments where they demonize the other side. They will only share with you either the right or the left. Good example is Tommy Lahren, Francis Maxwell, Glenn Beck are good examples of this. And last but not least, you have full-blown conspiracy theory, right? That's not based on anything. They sensationalize everything, and so you could argue that you have this is the origins of fake news, right? They make outlandish claims about political actors, celebrities that's clearly not based on fact. So the National Enquirer and those misleading hashtags, guys, you have to be careful what you share. You may be propagating conspiracy theory here. So, and of course, you may also be consuming it. So you have to be very careful, and you have to understand the differences between what is news, what is opinion, what is infotainment from propaganda and conspiracy theory. So continuing on our understanding of media literacy, the way that we understand really the spin, the media bias, where it's coming from, is it's important for all of us to consume all media from the political spectrum. I'm not telling you to change your media habits at all, but it would behoove you. It would behoove all of us to be able to read and consume media from both the left and the right and those in the middle. That's how we're going to understand the bigger picture. That's how we're going to not just get one side of the issue, but we'll be able to understand multidimensionally all of the arguments of these issues. When I was a graduate student at USC, I took a media and politics class, and my professor had us every week pull out current events, very similar to what you folks do, but she would have us pull out at least 10 to 15 articles regarding the same political story. And we would then print those articles and bring them to class, and we would then pin those articles on a wall where we would then arrange them ideologically, both from the left to the right to the center. She would then ask us to circle names, money, location, and then she would have us write just a brief two-page analysis on what we believe would happen in the future by the end of the semester. And what's interesting is we did this, and she did an analysis on our predictions, and about 80% of what we wrote came true. Because what were we doing? We were reading in between the lines, right? Given that we were exposing ourselves to a wide variety of news media articles about the same stories, we were able to find out about what those articles weren't telling us. And so this is part again of being civically engaged and being media literate, really, at the end of the day. I believe I mentioned this to you before. We have the right to information. What we don't have the right to is accurate information. And so we have to exercise our due diligence to know what's going on and to understand that what we're consuming is reliable and is true. And so again, you have to consume all media from all of the political spectrum. We have to rely on those reputable news outlets. We have to question those hyper-partisan news outlets and not succumb to conspiracy theory or fake news. One of the ways that you can find out if the website is reputable is look at the URL. Does it look fishy to you? A lot of the fake news have very suspicious URLs. abc.co.com is not reliable, for example. Try to figure out if this news story is being covered by other news outlets. You just have to be extra cautious. We have to be skeptical. And ultimately, you have to remain objective when you're reading these articles. Who's the author, right? Is the author someone who's authoritative or not? Which organization sponsored the article or the research? You have to dig a little bit deeper. As I've discussed before, you have to follow the money. What are the incentives of the owners of these news organizations? Do they have a bias? Do they have a spin? And for me, sometimes to get away from this, you may want to use, and you have access to it as a student, these academic databases that we have. Check out CQ Researcher and others that could provide you, again, well-researched articles from scholars who do their due diligence. And you have to understand the interview tricks as well. And I have a video here for you to watch to understand, how people deflect questions or perhaps not answer the questions. This is becoming more pervasive in our news media culture. So you have to be smart enough to understand their tricks here. So have you guys watch this video. Again, right here below, and once you're done, come back here and we'll finish up the lecture. Now, this is a very important phenomenon because this is quite recent, and given the hyperpartisanship, hyperpolarized world we live in, sometimes we ask ourselves, how did this come to be? And it becomes very, very disturbing when our intelligence community has evidence to show that foreign actors may be involved in undermining our democracy, undermining how we talk politics, undermining our elections. And again, this is true that this new age that we live in, we are more susceptible to that with the internet, with the World Wide Web. Um, War doesn't just occur in traditional conventional means with the military. You now have cyber war. And again, Russia in this case has been in the forefront of using technology to conduct these type of operations to undermine really its enemies, including us, of course, our democracy, with this disinformation. And so we've seen examples like the use of bots, creating these fake accounts to disseminate um, fake news that have no backing at all. We know that once these fake news are disseminated, um, we as well become part of the problem. Where if we succumb to these fake news, we may share them or retweet them in our social media feeds, such as Facebook and Twitter, and it acts as a virus, right? As it spreads, and you it's infested um, in our social media feeds, so much so that we start believing it to be true. And again, if you understand what Vladimir Putin is attempting to do, that is how he has found a way to undermine our democracy, is if we ultimately don't trust our institutions, particularly, again, the news media. This sows political division. And again, what comes to question is um, this problem of legitimacy that we'll have in questioning our democratic institutions, the press, our electoral systems. And again, you have to understand that it's not just foreign meddling, but you also have these extremist groups in Facebook whose job it is to propagate these conspiracy theories. And so, if you know a little bit about Facebook, they have these mathematical algorithms, and so the more you click and like these type of stories and conspiracy theories, you're going to be filtered with more of these similar type of stories. And this has some major implications and consequences, and not just how we talk politics, but we get radicalized by them. And we've seen that in recent times, where we have mass gunmen shooting up churches, that has led again to hate crimes. And so again, we have to be very careful in how we talk politics, particularly in this age of social media and the internet. And so we have to be vigilant, as I said, but I think back in our study of how the media covers government here, a little less controversial. We know that the media covers the presidency a lot. Typically, the media is involved in um, trying to cover the White House, of course, during the White House press conference. And it may seem very confrontational, these type of events like the White House press briefing. But I want to make an argument that it is a symbiotic relationship between the White House and the press, right? Because the president needs an outlet to disseminate his legislative agenda, his economic agenda, the way that he utilizes the bully pulpit is through speaking to the media. And of course, the media needs news to report, and so they need each other. Um, Again, it's also the president, whether the president is media savvy, whether or not the president has a good rapport with the media will determine whether or not he is successful in utilizing the media. We've seen some very effective presidents. I would categorize John F. Kennedy as one of them, right? During the first televised presidential debate, he was media savvy to know how to use the media to his advantage. Ronald Reagan, dubbed as the great communicator. Bill Clinton is pretty good. Barack Obama had a good rapport with the media. And then you could also identify presidents who have not had so much good of a relationship with the media as was these presidents. I'm thinking of Richard Nixon. I'm thinking of George W. Bush. I'm thinking of President Trump too, who has a disdain for the media. So again, it also depends on the president's relationship, whether or not he's effective in utilizing the media. The media can't cover all 535 members of Congress, so they focus instead on the leadership. And it's important for you to know that Congress typically gets hit hard with the media. Their approval rating is usually very low, sometimes in the low teens. And the reason being is because Congress investigates, right? They have the oversight powers. If anything happens, any scandal happens in our government, usually Congress investigates, and Americans view them as negative. And so, go back to the history from from Watergate to the Clinton Gates to 9/11 to all of these type of scandals. Congress usually pays the price. Although I will tell you that your individual representatives tend to have a much higher approval rating because we voted them in. So we like our own member of Congress, we just don't like the entire body, right? We blame Washington, we blame them as a group for not getting anything done. But hopefully you're starting to understand that that's just the nature of the legislative process. No one's going to get everything that they want. And so naturally here, Congress gets very low marks when it comes to, generally speaking, being covered by the media. The courts, not so much too. They don't get a lot of individual attention. The media doesn't cover individual justices. They usually cover the opinions from the cases that they heard. And it's a very secretive branch of government because cameras are not allowed in the U.S. Supreme Court, and most courts don't allow them as well. So again, the highlight is the cases. We've already covered prior restraint. Remember, this was the precedent from New York Times Company versus the United States. Remember, at the end of the day, the government cannot censor the press. Once it's been leaked, then the media and the press have the ability to publish the story or not to publish the story. So that does leverage the media here over our government institutions, keeping them accountable. That's why some scholars would say that the media here accounts as the fourth branch of government, keeping, again, our leaders accountable to us. And so here's my final slide on the media effects, and several hints here. I think when it comes to influencing all of us, if we don't have very strong opinions on an issue, then the media can have tremendous influence on us and how we view the issue, how we think about the issue. It can help sort of craft how we believe and how we see that particular issue. However, if we are pretty much solid on our values and our beliefs on a particular issue, the media won't have that much of a tremendous effect on us. We're grounded in believing that side of an issue or whatnot. Okay, if the topic is distant from our very lives, most Americans don't pay attention to foreign policy because it doesn't affect them. That's why most Americans, if you look at some recent polling or pollings from the past too, they've indicated that most Americans follow more of their local news rather than international news. And the problem with local news is that it's not robust reporting, not in-depth reporting. And so given that we rely on local news, doesn't necessarily mean we are getting much more in-depth news, which is important that we do. And so at the end of the day, we have to understand that the media has so many different pressures, that the media has a lot of bias as well, depending on who owns them. Their purpose here to try to get readership and viewership and have us click on their websites, read their newspapers, right? There's economic forces that are tugging there. And so we just have to be cognizant of the fact that the media frames the agenda and the stories that we read. So at the end of the day, we have to critically think about, again, given this lecture, we have to consider the polls that we consume, the media that we consume, and that we just have to be smart about it. Really, at the end of the day, we have to do our due diligence. And I think that's a good place for me to stop. I hope you found this lecture thought-provoking and important at the same time. And so with that said, you guys, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.